Adolf Hitler's German army had torn through Europe like a storm of steel and fire. Country after country fell: Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium. Now, in the spring of 1940, France was collapsing. The supposedly impregnable French defenses crumbled in just 6 weeks. The British army, fighting alongside the French, was in desperate retreat. Thousands of British soldiers raced toward the beaches of Dunkirk, a small port town on the northern coast of France. Behind them, German tanks and soldiers closed in for the kill. It seemed like the entire British army in Europe would be captured or killed. But through a combination of luck, determination, and hundreds of small boats crossing the English Channel, over 300,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated to safety in England. But not everyone made it out. Thousands of British soldiers were left behind, scattered across France and Belgium. Some were wounded. Some had become separated from their units in the chaos. Some had simply run out of time before the evacuation ended. As the German army swept across France, these stranded soldiers faced a choice: surrender or hide. Among those left behind was a man named Donald Caskie. But Caskie wasn't a soldier. He was a Scottish minister, a man of God, not war. And he was about to become one of the most unlikely heroes of World War II. The minister who stayed behind. Donald Caskie was born in 1902 in a small Scottish fishing village called Bowmore, on the island of Islay. He grew up surrounded by the sea, the smell of salt air, and the strong Presbyterian faith of the Scottish people. He became a minister and, before the war, had been assigned to work at the Scots Kirk, a Scottish church in Paris, France. When the Germans invaded France in May 1940, most British citizens fled. The British government urged everyone to leave immediately and return to England before it was too late. Ships and trains were arranged. The message was clear: get out now. But Donald Caskie looked around his church and saw desperate people. Refugees fleeing the advancing German army, wounded soldiers who couldn't travel, frightened families with nowhere to go. His congregation needed him. More than that, he felt God calling him to stay. So while almost every other British citizen in Paris was packing their bags and heading for the coast, Reverend Donald Caskie stayed. It was a decision that would change hundreds of lives. As the German army entered Paris in June 1940, Caskie watched the victorious Nazi soldiers march down the Champs-Élysées, their boots echoing off the cobblestones, their swastika flags fluttering in the breeze. Paris, the city of light, had gone dark. France surrendered on June 22, 1940. But the surrender came with a twist. Germany didn't occupy all of France. Instead, they divided it into 2 zones. The northern zone, including Paris, was directly occupied by German soldiers. The southern zone was left unoccupied, governed by a new French government based in the town of Vichy. This Vichy government was officially neutral but in reality worked closely with the Germans. The dividing line between occupied and unoccupied France became one of the most important borders in Europe. Crossing it without permission was illegal and extremely dangerous. But it also represented hope. If British soldiers trapped in the occupied zone could somehow reach unoccupied France, they might have a chance to escape. Moving south to the free zone, Caskie realized that Paris, deep in the occupied zone, was too dangerous for his work. The Germans were everywhere, and any help he gave to British soldiers would quickly be discovered. So he made a bold decision. He would move to the unoccupied zone in southern France. He traveled to Marseille, a large port city on the Mediterranean coast. Marseille was France's second-largest city, a bustling place full of sailors, merchants, refugees, and criminals. It was also full of desperate people trying to escape Europe. Since Marseille was still technically free from German occupation, it became a gathering point for anyone trying to flee. Jews escaping Nazi persecution, political refugees, resistance fighters, and stranded Allied soldiers. When Caskie arrived in Marseille in late 1940, he found the city overflowing with refugees. Tens of thousands of people had crowded into the city, all hoping to find some way out. A ship to America, a boat to North Africa, forged papers, anything. The streets were packed. People slept in doorways. Food was scarce. Hope was scarcer. Caskie looked for a church where he could work, but the only building he could find was a rundown old chapel called the Seamen's Mission. It had been used by British sailors when their ships docked in Marseille, but the war had shut down most shipping, so the mission stood empty and neglected. The building was in terrible condition. Windows broken, walls stained with mold, furniture missing. But Caskie saw potential. He rolled up his sleeves and went to work. He cleaned the chapel, repaired what he could, and officially reopened it as the Seamen's Mission at 46 Rue de Forbin. Over the door, he hung a sign, "The Church of Scotland Seamen's Mission." Inside, he placed a visitor's book where anyone who stopped by could sign their name. On the surface, it looked like a simple church mission for sailors. But Reverend Donald Caskie had much bigger plans. Started slowly, carefully. Caskie knew that all across France, British soldiers were in hiding. Some were injured and were sheltered by brave French families. Others were living in barns, forests, or abandoned buildings, trying to stay out of sight. The Germans had ordered all Allied soldiers to report to prisoner-of-war camps, but many refused. They hid instead, hoping somehow to find a way back to England. These soldiers faced terrible dangers. If caught by the Germans, they would be sent to POW camps, or worse, if the Germans suspected them of sabotage or resistance activity. The French police in Vichy France, under pressure from the Germans, were also searching for hidden Allied soldiers. Anyone caught helping them could be arrested, tortured, or executed. But some French people were willing to take the risk. They hid British soldiers in their homes, fed them, gave them civilian clothes to replace their uniforms, and passed them along to others who could help. Slowly, quietly, a network began forming. A chain of brave people, each doing their small part to help Allied soldiers move south toward freedom. Caskie became a crucial link in this chain. The Seamen's Mission became a safe house where soldiers could rest, get food, receive false identity papers, and get information about the next stage of their journey. Caskie worked with other members of the resistance to create this network. One of his key partners was a British Army doctor named George Rodocanacci, who ran a medical practice in Marseille and used it as cover to help escapees. They assembled at the train station in Marseille. Caskie was there to see them off, along with other members of the network. It must have been a tense moment. So many things could go wrong. If even one of the disguised soldiers panicked or said the wrong thing, the entire group could be arrested. But the men boarded the train, and the train pulled out of the station, heading northwest toward the Spanish border. Caskie had arranged for helpers to meet them at key points along the route, people who would make sure they changed trains correctly and didn't get lost. The journey took several days. The train traveled through the French countryside, stopping at various stations. At each stop, there was a chance of being questioned by police or officials. The men had been told to stay together, to speak only when necessary, and to let the real sailors do most of the talking if anyone asked questions. Remarkably, it worked. Station after station, checkpoint after checkpoint, the group passed through without serious problems. When officials saw the travel permits issued by the Vichy government, they waved the group through. No one looked too closely at individual identity papers. Finally, they reached the last town before the Spanish border. Here, Caskie had arranged for mountain guides to meet them. The men were divided into smaller groups. It would be impossible for 50 or 70 men to cross the mountains together. They would go in groups of 10 or 15 with a guide for each group, crossing on different nights. The mountain crossings happened over several nights. Each group gathered in the evening and met their guide, usually a local farmer or shepherd. As darkness fell, they began the climb. Imagine what this must have been like. You're a British soldier who has been hiding in France for over a year. You've lived in constant fear of discovery. You've slept in barns and cellars, eaten scraps, moved from place to place like a fugitive. You've trusted your life to strangers in the resistance network, never quite sure if the next person would betray you. And now, finally, you're so close to freedom you can almost taste it. But first, you have to climb a mountain in the dark. The paths were narrow and steep. In many places, there was no real path at all, just rocky slopes and loose stones. The men had to follow their guide in single file, moving as quietly as possible. One slip, one twisted ankle, one cry of pain could alert patrols. The guides knew where the patrols usually operated and tried to avoid those areas, but there was always risk. Some of the soldiers were in poor physical condition after months of hiding and malnutrition. The climb was exhausting, but they pushed on, driven by the thought of freedom, the hope of seeing England again, the desire to rejoin the fight against Hitler. Hour after hour they climbed, their legs burning, their lungs gasping in the thin mountain air. In winter, the cold was brutal. In summer, the heat during the day was oppressive, though the crossings were done at night when it was cooler. Finally, after 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours of walking, they would reach the highest point and begin the descent down the Spanish side. As the sun rose, they would arrive at a small Spanish village or encounter a Spanish Civil Guard patrol. Following Caskie's instructions, they identified themselves as British soldiers. The Spanish, as expected, arrested them and sent them to internment camps. But they had made it. They were out of occupied France. They were safe from the Germans. And they knew that, in a few weeks, the British government would negotiate their release and they would go home. Group after group made the crossing. Not all of them made it. Some were caught by French patrols before crossing, some got lost in the mountains, some were betrayed by informers. But most made it through. In total, through this one operation and others like it organized by Caskie and his network, hundreds of British soldiers escaped from France and returned to Britain. Donald Caskie continued his work in Marseille through 1941 and into 1942. He helped more and more soldiers escape. But his luck couldn't last forever. In November 1942, the Germans broke their agreement with Vichy France and occupied the entire country, including the southern zone. German soldiers and Gestapo agents flooded into Marseille. The city, which had been relatively safe, became extremely dangerous for anyone in the resistance. Caskie tried to continue his work, but the net was closing. In early 1943, he was betrayed. Someone, perhaps a paid informer, perhaps someone under torture, told the Germans about the British minister at the Seamen's Mission who was helping soldiers escape. The Gestapo arrested Donald Caskie. They interrogated him brutally. They wanted names of everyone in the network, everyone he had helped, everyone who had helped him. Caskie refused to talk. The Gestapo tortured him. Still he refused. The Germans put him on trial as a spy. The penalty for espionage was death. Caskie was convicted and sentenced to death by firing squad. He was sent to Frasnes prison in Paris to await execution. There, in a cold cell, he prepared to die. He prayed. He wrote letters to his family. He accepted his fate, believing he had done what God called him to do. But then something unexpected happened. A German Lutheran pastor named Harold Poelchaw, who served as a chaplain in German prisons, heard about Caskie's case. Poelchaw was secretly opposed to the Nazi regime. After the war, it was discovered he had helped many prisoners. He investigated Caskie's background and discovered something important. Caskie wasn't just a minister. He was a minister of the Church of Scotland. At the time, Italy was Germany's ally, and the Vatican, the headquarters of the Catholic Church in Rome, had some diplomatic influence with the German government. Poelchaw managed to get word to the Vatican about Caskie's case. Church officials, both Catholic and Protestant, began lobbying for Caskie's life to be spared, arguing that executing a Christian minister would be a propaganda disaster for Germany. The pressure worked, barely. At the last moment, Caskie's death sentence was commuted to imprisonment. Instead of being shot, he was sent to a concentration camp. He spent the rest of the war in Nazi concentration camps, enduring terrible conditions. But he survived. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, Donald Caskie was freed. He was thin, sick, traumatized, but alive. He returned to Scotland, where he was hailed as a hero. The British government awarded him the Order of the British Empire (OBE) for his wartime service. The French government awarded him the Croix de Guerre, one of France's highest military honors. After the war, Donald Caskie wrote a book about his experiences called The Tartan Pimpernel, a reference to the Scarlet Pimpernel, a famous novel about someone who smuggled people out of danger during the French Revolution. The book was published in 1957 and told the story of his work in Marseille and the escape network he organized. Through his book and other historical research, we learned the full extent of what Caskie and his network accomplished. Historians estimate that the network helped between 500 and 2,000 Allied soldiers escape from France. The exact number will never be known. Secrecy was essential during the war and many records were destroyed, but it was certainly hundreds, possibly more than 1,000. Each of those men went on to live the rest of his life, to return to his family, to see his children grow up, to perhaps serve again in the military and help win the war. Some of them died later in the war in other battles, but at least they died as free men fighting, not as prisoners in a camp. Many survived the war and lived long lives, forever grateful to the Scottish minister and the brave French men and women who had saved them. Donald Caskie himself returned to the ministry after the war. He served as a minister in various churches in Scotland, living a quiet life. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences unless asked. He was humble about what he had done, seeing it simply as his duty as a Christian and as a Scotsman. He died in 1983 at the age of 81. Today, there is a memorial plaque at the site of the Old Seamen's Mission in Marseille, honoring Caskie and the Escape Network. In Scotland, his memory is preserved in the church archives and in the stories passed down through families whose fathers and grandfathers he saved. Why it mattered, you might wonder. In a war where millions died and the fate of the world hung in the balance, why does the story of one minister helping a few hundred soldiers matter? It matters for several reasons. First, every life matters. Those hundreds of soldiers were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. To their families, their survival was everything. To save even one person from death or imprisonment in wartime is a profound act of goodness. Second, those soldiers returned to Britain and many of them went on to fight in other campaigns, in North Africa, in Italy, in the D-Day invasion. Some of them may have made crucial contributions to winning the war. History is made up of thousands of small actions that add up to big results. Third, the story of Donald Caskie and his silly escape plan reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. Caskie wasn't a trained spy or a soldier. He was a minister, a man of peace. But when he saw people in need, he acted. He didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. He didn't say, "I'm just a minister, what can I do?" He did what he could, and it turned out he could do a lot. Fourth, the story shows the power of networks and cooperation. Caskie didn't save those soldiers alone. He worked with dozens, maybe hundreds of other people. French farmers who hid soldiers, forgers who made false papers, train conductors who looked the other way, mountain guides who risked their lives leading strangers through the Pyrenees. Each person in the network did their small part, and together they achieved something remarkable. It's a reminder that we're stronger together than alone. Finally, the story shows that even in the darkest times, goodness persists. When Hitler's armies were conquering Europe, when evil seemed to be winning, when it would have been so easy to just look after yourself and ignore others' suffering. Even then, people like Donald Caskie chose to help. They chose courage over safety. They chose compassion over indifference. Caskie's network was part of a larger phenomenon in World War II. All across occupied Europe, brave people created secret networks to help Allied soldiers, shot down airmen, Jews fleeing the Holocaust, and political refugees escape to safety. One of the most famous was the Comet Line, which operated in Belgium and France and helped hundreds of Allied airmen escape after their planes were shot down. Another was the Pat O'Leary Line, named after a Canadian doctor who helped organize escape routes through southern France. The Dutch Paris Line helped people escape from the Netherlands. These networks operated under constant danger. The Germans and their collaborators were always hunting for them. Many of the people involved were caught, tortured, and executed. The Belgian woman André de Jong, who co-founded the Comet Line, was captured by the Gestapo and sent to concentration camps but survived. Her father, who also worked in the network, was executed. Hundreds of helpers died. But the networks kept operating because people believed it was the right thing to do. They couldn't stand by and watch while Allied soldiers were captured or while Jewish families were deported to death camps. They had to do something. Donald Caskie's network was one link in this chain of courage that stretched across occupied Europe. Together, these networks saved thousands of lives. What can we learn from Donald Caskie's story today? Ordinary people can make a difference. You don't have to be a superhero or have special powers. Caskie was just a minister, but he had courage, compassion, and creativity. He saw a need and found a way to help. Bureaucracy can be beaten. Caskie's silly plan worked partly because he figured out how to use the system against itself. By getting official permission for a repatriation of merchant seamen, he created cover for smuggling soldiers. Sometimes the solution to a problem isn't to fight the system head-on, but to find a clever way around it. Networks amplify individual action. Caskie couldn't have saved anyone without the French families who hid soldiers, the forgers who made papers, the guides who led people over mountains. None of these people could have done much alone. Together, they were powerful. Courage is contagious. When people saw Caskie taking risks to help others, it inspired them to take risks too. When soldiers saw others successfully escaping, it gave them hope to try. One person's bravery can spark bravery in others. Small acts add up. Giving a soldier a bowl of soup doesn't sound heroic. Letting someone sleep on your floor doesn't sound dramatic. But these small acts of kindness, repeated hundreds of times, added up to hundreds of lives saved. Faith can be a source of strength. Caskie's Christian faith gave him the courage to stay in danger when he could have fled to safety. His belief that every human life is sacred motivated him to risk his own life for others. Throughout history, many, though certainly not all, of the people who have stood up against evil have been motivated by religious faith or strong moral principles. The importance of documentation. We know Caskie's story partly because he kept that visitor's book at the Seaman's Mission and partly because he wrote his memoir after the war. Many other heroes of World War II are forgotten because their stories were never recorded. If you know someone who has done something extraordinary, encourage them to tell their story or help them record it. In 1940, a Scottish minister faced a choice. He could leave France and return to safety in Britain, or he could stay and try to help people in need. He stayed. Over the next 3 years, Donald Caskie organized one of the most successful escape networks in World War II. His silly plan, disguising soldiers as merchant seamen and evacuating them under official cover, was actually brilliant. It saved hundreds of lives. He paid a terrible price for his courage: arrest, torture, imprisonment in concentration camps. But he survived, and after the war, he returned to a quiet life in Scotland, content with having done his duty. The soldiers he saved went home to their families. Some fought again and helped win the war. All of them had a chance to live the rest of their lives because one minister refused to look away when people needed help. It's a story about courage, creativity, compassion, and the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. In a war that killed millions and destroyed so much, it's a story of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are people who will risk everything to help others, who will stand up to evil, who will choose light over darkness. Donald Caskie's silly escape plan wasn't silly at all. It was genius.